Mesdames, Messieurs, chers collègues, chers doctorants, chers étudiants, je vous remercie pour votre présence aujourd'hui pour cette deuxième séance du séminaire ISSMDA, International Seminar on Social Media Discourse Analysis, consacré à l'analyse linguistique des publications numériques des réseaux sociaux. Lors de la séance inaugurale, nous avons écouté la conférence de Julien Langui, associant analyse qualitative et analyse quantitative pour l'exploration des corpus de publications issus des réseaux sociaux. Vous pouvez d'ailleurs revoir la vidéo de cette conférence sur la page dédiée au séminaire sur le site du LERMA ou sur le carnet de recherche hypothèse.org du séminaire. La séance du séminaire avec Céline Pouda de l'Université de Nice-Côte d'Azur sur la conflictualité sur la plateforme Wikipédia sera reprogrammée à la rentrée prochaine à la demande de la conférencière. Je vous rappelle que vous pouvez vous abonner à la liste de diffusion du séminaire pour rester informé de toute son actualité. Je vais vous préciser le déroulement de cette séance. Nous allons entendre notre conférencier. À la suite de sa présentation, vous pourrez poser vos questions si vous êtes dans la salle ou si vous êtes à distance avec Zoom. Vous ouvrirez votre micro et vous pourrez aussi poser votre question dans le chat. Je vous demanderai pour l'instant de bien vouloir couper vos micros pendant la présentation. Vous pourrez ensuite les rallumer lors de la séance de questions. Nous avons le plaisir d'accueillir aujourd'hui Dr Lieven Vandelanotte, qui vient spécialement de Belgique pour sa conférence. Je remercie à cette occasion le laboratoire LERMA pour le financement de sa mission. I am now switching to English to introduce him and to introduce his topic, as his paper today will be delivered in English. We'll have the possibility to ask our keynote speaker questions either in English or in French, so feel free to interact with him at the end of his paper. Let me remind you of the importance of the transnational perspective that prevails in this seminar and through its various sessions. The international aspect of this seminar is intrinsic to its creation, since it associates several European universities, Brussels, Stockholm, Aix-Marseille, inside the European University, CIVIS, and also Maison Française d'Oxford. This is precisely why we are delighted today to welcome Dr. Lieven Vandelanotte from Belgium. I would like to express my greatest thanks to Lieven Vandelanotte, who found the time to travel from Belgium to France. I know he's very busy, as he has been at the head of the English unit since 2018. And he has also been at the head of the Germanic Languages and Literatures department for 1 year. Lieven Vandelanotte is Associate Professor of English Linguistics at the University of Namur and Research Fellow in Linguistics at KU Leuven. In addition to around 35 journal articles or book chapters, he published in 2009 the monograph Speech and Thought Representation in English, a Cognitive Functional Approach, a joint monograph with Barbara Dancygier entitled Multimodal Discourse, Viewpoint and Figuration Across Image and Text, will be published soon by Cambridge University Press. For almost 10 years, Lieven Vandelanotte was the editor of the journal English Text Construction, John Benjamin's publishing. He has also co-edited 8 books or journal special issues. His paper today is entitled Labeling Memes as an Emerging Discourse Genre. Memes are very common as popular forms of graphic and written expressions that are widespread on social media platforms. These multimodal objects need special methodologies to be analyzed. This is why an increasing number of linguists have chosen to study these specific corpora. When it comes to try to classify memes according to their structures, some memes seem to share common properties that can lead to the identification of a class of a specific discourse genre. These classes should be named according to the structures the memes have in common. This is precisely the topic that our keynote speaker is going to discuss today. Lieven, it's your turn.
Merci beaucoup. J'en profite peut-être pour déjà demander aux gens qui nous suivent sur Zoom s'ils m'entendent bien. Et entre-temps, je pense que je devrais repiquer le truc pour que les gens voient quelque chose.
Tu peux partager ton écran. Tu peux partager ton écran normalement. Directement.
Ah, je comprends. OK. OK, vous m'entendez. Just a bit of housekeeping first. Alors. Désavantage, c'est que je n'ai plus my presenter's view. Je ne comprends pas pourquoi ça a incidence sur ça.
Comment tu peux connecter?
Ah, si. Je vais réessayer. Désolé. Hein. Ça va? Okay. Apologies for my slight confusion here. We had to change the setup very slightly just before we began. So I think for the people in the room, the screen is going to look a little bit squeezed. But I mean, you know, that's life, I suppose. I think for the people at home, it probably looks more or less okay. So thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And it's a pleasure to be back in X, which I had already been pleased to visit a number of years ago. So you might know the guy in the picture here, Richard Dawkins, invents the concept of memes, not quite what he had in mind, because of course the notion of memes predates the notion of internet memes that we tend to use today. It was introduced in his 1976 book on the selfish gene, based on a sort of analogy with the biological notion of genes, with the idea that a meme would then be a unit of cultural replication, basically a unit of cultural transmission. So you have a little quote there: memes propagate themselves in the meme pool by leaping from brain to brain via a process which, in the broad sense, can be called imitation. And examples of memes as envisioned by Dawkins back then include, for instance, tunes, ideas, catchphrases, clothes fashions, ways of making pots, or of building arches and so on. So all sorts of things. Nothing to do with the internet at all. But of course, we do have the internet now. And so there's a sort of internet specific sense that we can also give to memes. There have been a number of book-length publications recently, in the last few years. One important difference in the way in which the notion of meme is being used to talk about internet memes is that we've moved beyond these biological analogies, because memes in the internet sense are pretty different. In the biological sense, genes are selfish genes. They just want to procreate. They just want to keep the species alive, as it were. Humans are just passive recipients to allow genes to continue to exist and propagate, etc. Whereas, of course, internet memes involve active agency, people creatively changing things, modifying things to show how clever they are, how funny they are, and so on. So the mutations, if you want to continue the analogy, in the case of memes, are deliberate and creative rather than sort of random. And then, you know, the survival of the fittest picks out the strong mutations and they continue, and so on. So it's pretty different. A widely quoted definition is the one by Schiffman there of internet memes as or an internet meme as a group of digital items. You can never just look at one object and say it's a meme. It has to be part of a group for it to qualify, as it were, as a meme. A group of digital items sharing common characteristics of form and or stance, which were created with awareness of each other and were circulated, imitated, and or transformed via the internet by many users. Lots of things come under that notion, including all sorts of video things like, you know, the Untergang spoofs of Hitler in the bunker, and then you add sort of nonsensical subtitles to make a joke on that. Older ones like the lolcats and the Doge, you know, that sort of funny looking dog with the multicolored words around it in bad English, that sort of thing, lip dubs, which companies might make to promote themselves in some way and so on. So those are all examples of things I won't be talking about. There's a lot that you could include. The focus here is mainly going to be on sort of package combinations of image and text, although there will be variations without text, for instance, and so on. Given the origin of the notion of meme and then the internet sense of memes, there remains a kind of fluidity in the use of the terms, because of course you can also have memes in the old sense, more or less in the Dawkins sense of ideas and catchphrases and so on, that circulate on Twitter, for instance, or on Reddit or whatever. That doesn't really bother me, but it's worth being aware of that potential ambiguity there. So I've tried to structure this presentation so we will culminate in the actual topic of labeling memes, or the one that was announced, but I'd like to review a few general points to do with the idea of viewing internet memes as a kind of linguistic construction, and also sort of highlight some of the ways in which meaning emerges in internet memes. How do we put together the various components to construct the overall meaning of the image-text combination typically. A few brief words about genre, because that's not really my domain, but I try to introduce a few notions there that might be relevant, and then a whole section on labeling memes. So memes have been proposed as sort of analyzable in terms of linguistic notions of constructions, where I'm sort of referring to the construction grammar or cognitive linguistics notion of constructions as conventional symbolic units. So conventional in the sense that they're shared across a speech community. Symbolic simply means that they pair a certain form with a consistent meaning, so it's not sort of random. And units are entrenched routines, things that we do routinely in language. In construction grammar, constructions are seen as ranging from abstract schemas like the transitive construction or the resultative construction or whatever, all the way down to specific instances like the vicar hit the burglar, or I painted the wall white, or something like that, with possibly intermediate levels, also large in size and small, like a word is a construction because it pairs a form with a meaning. Constructions are seen as having network structure. They're linked. There are all sorts of relations between constructions, and we'll illustrate that a little bit later on in some examples. Also, they're assumed to have prototype structure in the same way that lexical categories have prototype structures. If you think of birds, some birds are more typical birds, others like penguins or kiwis or whatever, or ostriches, share some features with prototypical birds, but don't share others. So you have that sort of radial view of the core examples and then the more peripheral, less prototypical examples. That also applies to constructions. If you think of a transitive construction, the vicar hit the burglar, prototypical transitive, transfer of energy, the burglar will be hurt and so on. So there's an effect on the patient. Whereas the car cost, 6,000 euros, you can't say 6,000 euros was cost by the car. It's similar structure, but clearly not as prototypically transitive. Similarly, again, if you're looking at internet memes as constructions, some will be closer to a kind of prototype, and a lot of fun will be had in deviating from those prototypes. In construction grammar, people also distinguish different types of idiomaticity. There are many dimensions to that, but one that I may refer to a few times is the difference between so-called substantive or lexically filled idioms, like to kick the bucket, meaning to die. Lexically, that's fixed. Of course, you can vary grammatically. He kicked the bucket. Well, that would be difficult to say. I kicked the bucket, because then you're dead. But anyway, versus something like the let alone construction, where let alone is fixed, but everything around it, I didn't get up in time to cook lunch, let alone cook breakfast, for instance, that sort of thing. All of that changes. So there's a lot there that is lexically open-ended, up in the air. Multimodal, there are many meanings to, or at least two big meanings to multimodality. Often in cognitive linguistics, it's used to talk about what I'm sort of doing in the room here, which is gesturing with my hands all the time and so on, all sorts of forms of embodied behavior, facial expressions, body posture, hand gestures, and so on. But here I'm using multimodal in the other sort of tradition, the semiotic tradition, referring mainly to the combinations of the two semiotic modes, as it were, of text and image. So the next few slides sort of present some examples and some selected discussion from a longer argument that you can find in the published version quoted there in the slide. So one example is that of so-called predictive image macro meme. So image macro simply means you have a repeated image and you have some text that changes that you add on top of it. And these sorts of examples, like the one you have there, of good girl Gina gets mad at you, tells you why, or scumbag Steve uses shopping cart, leaves it in empty parking space, breaks something expensive of yours, and then you have a quote there, why would you spend that much on it anyway? So they're predictive in the sense that they're similar in meaning to, you know, when good girl Gina gets mad at you, then she tells you why. So in these sorts of examples, images of stock characters are used that don't transparently reflect, you know, necessarily scumbag behavior. For instance, I mean, if you look at Steve, he doesn't look that intimidating to me, sort of with his rosy cheeks and so on. He looks a bit nonplussed, sort of, so it's a little bit random. But they have come to represent, for instance, inconsiderate behavior in the case of scumbag Steve, or good girl behavior in the case of Gina, and so on. So some salient aspects of existing linguistic predictive constructions, when then constructions, or if then constructions, have been retained. You have the parallelism across two clausal parts. You have the use of the habitual present tense. Even the fact that there isn't an explicit conjunction is not unusual, because we can do that in language forms as well. She gets mad at you, she tells you why. The top text and bottom text reflects a kind of division of labor similar to the sort of logical analysis of these constructions. If P, or when P, then Q. One striking feature is that because of the visual that is there, you can drop the subject argument, as in gets mad at you, she, no, good girl Gina gets mad at you, so it's filled in visually, which otherwise, of course, wouldn't really be good English. It's not always a case of subject being filled in. So in the bottom example there with the quote, in the bottom text of that one, what you have filled in visually is the speaker of that quote, right? If scumbag Steve breaks something expensive of yours, then he would sort of respond by saying, well, you know, why would you spend that much on it anyway? Again, this is something that isn't unique. Of course, what's unique about it is that it's filled in visually, but we do have forms of sort of genre-based argument omission. So certain genres allow you to drop arguments that are normally obligatory. Like if you write a diary, went to the cinema last night, you don't have to write I went to the cinema last night. Or in a recipe, or whisk, and I don't know, something, you don't have to mention the object. The language on labels, you know, was grown in France or whatever. You don't have to repeat the product that you're labeling in the subject position. Some other sort of linguistic features that we can recognize from other contexts include the sort of newspaper headline style, the fact that you can leave out determiners like shopping cart rather than a shopping cart, or the use of quotation. So you could see these sorts of constructions as parts of a larger network of constructions, where you have the linguistic ones at the top, and you have the conjunctionless one as a version of that, and then you have further sort of inheritance of some features, but specialization with other specific features. towards the bottom of that diagram with the conjunctionless predictive image macro construction. Again, we can have several specific ones subsumed under that. So these examples that we started with are textually completely open, PQ basically, and it can be anything pretty much. Many other, of course, image macro memes do have some fixed text that's always going to be there. So they have a larger degree, as it were, of idiomaticity or fixity. One does not simply, for instance, one does not simply, win an argument with a woman. A lot of these memes are very sexist. I don't always X, but when I do Y, X, but that's none of my business. So you have some examples there of the one does not simply, the I don't always work, but when I do, I start an hour before I leave. And the Kermit one there, posting all of your relationship problems on Facebook is probably why you have so many relationship problems, but that's none of my business. The bottom bullet there on the slide just makes the point that these meanings, or the meanings that we get in these meme constructions, are specific to the meme. You don't just put the meaning together in the same way as you would otherwise. To demonstrate that, you have some purely textual examples. One does not simply barge into someone's office like that is a kind of reprimand. Shouldn't do that, which isn't the meaning of the one does not simply meme, right? Because the meaning of the meme is basically, this is an impossible task. It can't be done. You can try, but this is hopeless, never going to work, that sort of thing. Or the example of the I don't always go to London for Christmas, but when I do, I go by train. It's just a description of a habit, sort of a habitual fact. Whereas the specialized meaning of the meme is about making a sort of recommendation, in a humorous way, of course, but still it's basically a kind of recommendation meaning that you get. Of course, again, we can have deviations from the prototype. You can have this sort of image macro which deliberately leaves out an image, for instance. You can blend and combine memes in various ways, like you have the phrase of the I don't always X with the image of the Kermit meme in the middle example there. You can even have something that is similar to what in English would be a splinter morpheme, like the aholic in alcoholic becoming used in shopaholic, shockaholic, which, as a Belgian, I have to admit to being. So here you have the independent element of the hat worn by Scumbag Steve in the Scumbag Steve meme becoming independently meaningful, as if it becomes its own morpheme, basically. So that whenever it's placed on someone or even something in a meme, it turns that person into the bad guy. So here we have Henry VIII, Churchill wants to uphold his morals, starts a new church. Some further patterns by way of illustration. The can I wear your Crocs? Said no one ever. So you have a fixed phrase, said no one ever, that always recurs in these. The image varies, and the meaning is basically a kind of reversal, sort of ridiculing the idea that anybody could ever ask to borrow somebody else's Crocs, because it's too ridiculous to think that anybody could ever think that Crocs are fashionable, that sort of thing. When memes, as in the example there, when you're at a party full of people you don't know, so you stay with your friend the whole time, and you then, it feels like, or you behave like the koala that won't let go of the ankle there in the picture. So they're basically the only thing that is textually fixed is just the when, and the rest is a clause, and then the second part is not given textually, but given visually. Similarly with if memes that are quite close in the way they work to those when memes, if 2020 was a swing, then it would be a swing like this, because it was such a horrible year for everyone for all the known reasons and so on. So they're kind of like the linguistic constructions, but they are completed by the visual. Labeling memes, to which we will return later, don't have any fixed words, not even a purely grammatical word like when or if. They can use widely divergent images, like in this one here, a bit similar to the swing example in terms of its meaning. In 2019, a wall being built was an orderly, dependable, solid wall. And then by the time we get to 2022, it's all over the place. It sort of does the job, but everything has changed and it's all a big mess, sort of thing. Although, as we'll see, and as you probably know, if you think of the disloyal boyfriend, which is the best known one, some of those images do become recognizable construction-like patterns. Some aspects to do with the meaning emergence. Not that constructions, of course, are related to meaning emergence, but I'm trying to tease out some things a little bit to give some structure to this. One important factor is that of frames, the notion of lexical frames as used in linguistics, or at least in construction grammar and cognitive linguistics, goes back to Charles Fillmore. One of the typical examples is if you use the verb buy, it immediately calls up a whole corner of knowledge about transactions. Commercial transactions involve a seller, a buyer, a good being transacted, a price being paid, and so on. Or if you say uncle, well, it implies that there's an aunt and that there's a brother relationship with your father or your mother, and all those sorts of things. Well, you can extend the notion of those so-called cognitive frames to include visuals, and they seem to work very well to explain how a lot of these memes get their meaning. For instance, a visual scene from the film The Lord of the Rings, where the phrase "one does not simply" is used, with the continuation "walk into Mordor," becomes a recognizable sort of analog to talk about new examples of other things that are impossible, that are sort of super ambitious and that you can never really successfully achieve. So sort of hopeless tasks, impossible tasks. The example of the "I don't always, but when I do" was originally a commercial for a beer brand. I don't always drink beer, but when I do, it's Dos Equis. So again, that's been generalized into a kind of recommendation frame. In those two examples, there's a very specific cultural artifact to which the meme harks back, film scene or a commercial, etc. In other cases, that's not the case, and images are sort of, or have been sort of selected in a more ad hoc way, as we saw, for instance, with Scumbag Steve or Good Girl Gina. Nevertheless, they can still become framing devices, because now people who are meme proficient, who know about these memes, will see, you know, if they see Scumbag Steve, they know, okay, this is going to be about rude, inconsiderate, perhaps typically male behavior, and so on. Viewpoint is a major factor in the emergence of meanings of these sorts of artifacts. Various viewpoints can be added in memes, especially through various forms of quotation, as with the use of said, no, or never, or be like, or quotation marks, and so on. And these viewpoints integrate with frame knowledge and with constructional features to resolve into what you could see as sort of the final meaning of the meme, the final sort of discourse viewpoint. I have a couple of examples of diagrams. They're worth whatever they're worth. There's lots of lines and so on in them. That doesn't matter so much, but maybe you or we can make some sense of it. But the idea of those sorts of diagrams is that they rely on the mental spaces framework, and if you're familiar with that, they might be more readable than if not. But even if not, if you take the example of the said, no, or never meme here, I love listening to all the crap you're going through and you're never asking about my crap. It's awesome. Said, no, or never. The idea is that on the left hand there, you get the sort of top text, which is a sort of discourse space. We see the image of somebody on the phone. We see quotation marks. We assume this is a quotation. But then you get the arrow to the right-hand side of the slide there. You come to the sort of faux reporting clause. It isn't ultimately really a reporting clause, but it uses the direct speech construction, as it were. Then that's revealed to be a kind of unattributable or impossible quote. There is no speaker for this quote. Nobody exists that would ever say that. So ultimately, you resolve that towards the top of the diagram there in the meaning, the overall meaning, namely that no one likes it if people behave like that. So you're sort of pretend quoting a viewpoint, the bit at the top of the frame of the image in quotation marks, only to sort of show it up as being something that is too ridiculous for anybody to seriously believe. The end result, of course, is that you've reversed the viewpoint, because the ultimate meaning of the frame is the opposite of the expressly stated utterance there. So this diagram, again, I'm not going to go through all of them in detail, but just to show how you can then add these notions of frames. You start from the top text again, you have a quote there, that's like 3.5 grams. So then you would expect that, that corresponds to reality. If somebody says it's 3.5 grams, then it's going to be 3.5 grams. That's this sort of socially desirable sort of next bit that you would expect to see. However, because we integrate this with knowledge that this is scumbag Steve, that this is going to be bad, inconsiderate behavior, etc., we end up with a different cue, a different consequence, as it were, where it turns out there's only 2 grams. And you've been conned, basically. The overall viewpoint floating towards the top there, bad guys are inconsiderate and unreliable. Similarly here, another sort of quotative form with be like. Also, you have the scumbag hat, so you sort of have 2 elements there. You have the image macro of the geography teacher, the unhelpful high school teacher, and the scumbag hat, reminding us of sort of inconsiderate behavior again. And, well, you can see the overall meaning there. Teachers do things which students find unhelpful and annoying. Don't pack up yet. We still have 5 seconds of class left. Just a final example of one of these diagrams. It's a bit of a complicated one because obviously, as you immediately see, it's turned the one does not simply one upside down. So you immediately sort of have the knowledge of, well, if this is upside down, this must reflect perspective. There's something odd about flipping it on its head like that. And again, we know that we're going to be talking about something that is impossible to do, a futile undertaking. And finally, you have the frame knowledge there of, it's talking about Australia. We know that Australia is down under. So that sort of explains this flipping on its head that we see in the image. So one does not simply mock Australia. Well, in the end, the overall meaning here is basically, it's irresistible to mock Australia. You can't possibly not mock Australia. That sort of idea. Some other aspects of meaning emergence include the notion of multimodal simile. So rather than metaphor, Adrian Liu has made a strong argument to suggest that, for instance, in when memes, but not only in those, the sort of figurative language use we get is probably not so much metaphor, where you completely consider whole domains in terms of whole other domains. For instance, you treat spatial expressions as referring to time. I'll see you at 2 o'clock or whatever, or life is a journey, all those sorts of examples where you can see whole relations between whole domains. And in cognitive linguistics, that's often referred to in terms of blending, conceptual integration of 2 domains. In simile, you sort of still see the 2 domains. In textual simile, that's clear because you often use words and phrases like and as if. It doesn't have to be one of those 2. There are many other ways in which you can signal simile textually, but there's something there that draws your attention to the fact that a figurative comparison is being made in a way that a metaphor doesn't. If you say Juliet is the sun, there isn't a word there that sort of says, hello, I'm being metaphorical. Right? In simile, you do have that. These visual examples could be considered as cases of multimodal simile, because the visual is so completely unrelated to the text, and the text is sort of there to guide your reading. It's sort of telling you, well, I want you to see just one particular aspect, not whole domains being merged, but one particular respect in terms of which these 2 completely different things share something. For instance, here you have, when people say they are open-minded, then you have, it feels like, or it is like, opening a lid, and then you see there's another lid, that sort of thing. Right. So when people say they're open-minded, you typically feel like you're trying to open a can with a double lid. Once you've removed the outer lid, you see another one underneath, and the content of the can remains inaccessible. So you don't actually have access to the person's mind at all. Over and above all of this, of course, and that's been implicit all along, but it's worth just making it explicit very briefly, of course, humor plays a major role in this. Humorous forms of indirectness and incongruity. What does, a can with two lids have to do with people being open-minded or not, and so on. So there's sort of fun in sorting out the relation between the visual and the text, for instance. Well, a very short section, because I'm not a specialist on this at all, to do with the notion of genre, simply because I thought what I wanted to contribute to the seminar related perhaps most to this research question among the research questions that the seminar addresses, namely the identification of genres in social media discourse. The notion of genre has been used a number of times in publications on memes. One early paper there by Wiggins and Bowers is entitled Memes as Genre and sees memes as developing across three stages. First, you have spreadable media, something that can go viral. One example is the Numa Numa video. I don't know if you remember that song. I can't sing, but hello. I can't sing, but Numa Numa features in the text. Just trust me on that. And then you start to have modifications. One famous one was a person who really filled the screen with headphones, who was sort of miming along to the Numa Numa song. And then you start to have, for instance, SpongeBob SquarePants versions of Numa Numa, etc. Then it sort of fully blossomed into a real meme. So they suggest that you can see these sort of stages in the emergence of a meme genre. There's a long quote there, which I will skip. One other sort of link with notions to do with genre is something I already mentioned, the example of so-called genre-based argument, omission, which we can find in various textual genres, like the language of product labels can drop the subject because it's obvious what the subject is, it's the product, whose label you're reading. Diary writing, again, the subject is so obvious that you can just drop it because it's always the same person. You're writing about yourself in your diary. Food recipes, there it's not the subject but the object that is obvious. You have to use the ingredients. You have to do this and that and the other thing with the ingredients. So you don't have to keep mentioning the object. Similarly, in these predictive meme constructions, you don't have to mention the subject textually because it's given visually. In sort of discourse applications of construction grammar, people have studied genres such as recipes, horoscopes, scholarly commons, telephone conversations, all sorts of genres. And one notion that emerges from that is this perhaps obvious notion of a template that is appropriate to characterize genres. And that seems to be something that works especially well for memes, because the template can be an image plus a phrase, or just an image, or and so on. So that might be a fruitful approach to sort of characterize meme genres, because there are these immediately recognizable elements of presentation, whether it's a signature phrase plus a fixed image like one does Not Simply and the face of Boromir in the film scene from The Lord of the Rings, or a fixed word like when or if, and then the rest is more open in terms of text plus an image that is open, or just the fact that you have an image with labels on top of it. So the overall image text presentation as a single combined object can identify some artifact, something created by human beings on the internet as part of the internet meme genre, and then more specific presentational templates can identify subgenres with possibly further subtypes within them. Okay, finally we arrive at sort of the main point here, as it were, the section on labeling memes or object labeling memes, where the presentational template is quite general. The whole point is you superimpose words or phrases onto different parts of some holistic scene in a picture. The picture doesn't have to be fixed. Again, some become specialized constructions, and we'll come back to the example of the disloyal boyfriend, but in principle, it could be any picture, any words that you put onto different parts of the picture. So not a single part of the text is fixed. In that sense, it's completely lexically open. And again, the image can be anything, although some have become fixtures, have become especially popular and productive. So these labels then serve as guides for the viewer / reader to the intended figurative interpretation of the scene. And this is different from non-meme uses of labels. We don't often do that, but one context where we do that, of course, is in instructional context, school books and so on. Label the different, parts of a book, or the different parts of la casa, the house, that sort of thing. There, of course, the whole point is to literally name the corresponding parts of the image and not to do anything sort of creative. So looking at labeling memes, some of them are pretty much one-off. So instead of calling them constructions, you could call them constructs. One-off creative constructs that are basically, if you look at the image there, far too complicated to become entrenched and to become popular constructions. It's too much work. It's too complicated to sort out what's happening there. So you have my eyes, words, you're trying to pour the words into my brain, but all of the knowledge that is contained in the words actually misses the recipient. You just sort of spill all of it onto the tabletop. Whereas in the second example there, very elegantly, your eyes and memes and the dankness, the weirdness of the memes, that goes straight into the brain. So you can sort of decode it, trying to absorb knowledge into my brain by reading the words in a book. That fails because all of the words and the knowledge are spilt, basically, but absorbing weird, dank memes into my brain, that works perfectly fine. No problem with that. They are poured effortlessly into my brain. At the other extreme, you might say, you have ones that are repeated very often. You have the trumpet boy one there, society, and then my sanity. Everything that happens around me in society is just driving me crazy. I don't want to hear it. I want to shut it out, just as the girl there wants to shut out the horrible trumpet playing by the boy pursuing her. Or the "is this a pigeon" meme, or the butterfly meme, or whatever we want to call it, derived from a Japanese anime where the person represented is not really a human person, it's an android, and he hasn't yet been completely programmed. So in the original context, it makes sense for the person to point at a flying creature and ask, "Is this a pigeon?" Because the android hasn't completely mastered the language yet. But of course, for us, it seems odd, because obviously it isn't a pigeon, it's a butterfly. And so this has come to be applied in all sorts of other contexts where people mistake one thing for another thing, more or less. The example here was actually tweeted out by Netflix back in 2018. Is this a teen? And then you have high school TV dramas pointing at a sexy 20-year-old actor. So criticizing the idea that people who are supposed to represent high school teenagers are often played by 28-year-olds or 30-year-olds who look sort of unbelievably handsome and so on. So those are probably two sort of ends of a spectrum. You can think of intermediate kinds of labeling memes where what they share with the left-hand side of the slide is that there are a lot of things being labeled. On the other hand, they're not that complicated because underlyingly there is a central opposition. In this case, there is one customer who is just doing his business, continuing his meal, reading his phone or whatever, and then there are all of the others together having a fight, having a heated argument. So in this case, it's applied to the idea that Radiohead is the cool band who are not fussed about all of this sort of internal strife between all of the Britpop bands of the 1990s, Suede, Pulp, Blur, and Oasis. Although that is perhaps disrespecting Suede and Pulp slightly, but anyway. Or similarly, probably can't read this, it's very, very small, but there are lots like this. You have this sort of huge coffee pot with 5 spouts. Again, it's complicated because it has lots of labels, but it's not as complicated as the one on the left of the slide, in the sense that you have a basic opposition between the coffee pot, in this case, defund the police, and the multiple recipients there, the multiple cups there, which here are labeled as education, universal healthcare, youth services, housing, other community reinvestments. Even those one-off constructs that don't, end up being repeated and reused by other people on the internet who want to show a new funny variation of it, still rely on overall properties of the labeling meme pattern. So we would still posit some sort of highly schematic labeling meme construction. Note again the absence of full blending. We don't apply the whole domain, for instance, of kebab shop dining in the example of Radiohead versus Blur and so on, to the domain of music bands, or we don't apply the whole domain of drink recipients in the dank meme example to the domain of knowledge. We just highlight one particular shared facet. The process of figuring out what that particular facet of correspondence between those two apparently completely unrelated domains is part of the fun that sort of makes it enjoyable and playful for the viewer and also for the maker of the meme. So probably the most popular or the best known example of a labeling meme that has really become a construction is a disloyal boyfriend meme that is like a three-place verbal predicate, like X prefer Y to Z, that sort of thing, where the original frame that you have in the image of romantic disloyalty is repurposed to mark shifts from an old to a new interest or an old to a new preference. That initially, in the initial picture, we have romantic disloyalty. You can read off the image based on our cultural knowledge of heterosexual relationships and of all of the embodied. You have the sort of look of anger and frustration and despair on the girlfriend's face. You have the very appreciative facial expressions on the boy's face. You have his posture of turning over to look over his shoulder to the girl who has just passed, and so on. The example here is in Swedish. This was part of an advertising campaign by an internet service provider in Sweden, confusingly for me called Bahnhof, because that's a German word for a station, isn't it? I don't really understand, but anyway, where the whole point is that, you would prefer our company, you would prefer working for our company to working for your current employer. Apparently, this ad was ruled as sexist by the advertising regulator in Sweden because it objectifies women and stereotypes men. So, to get a handle on how this works, I mean, we inherently see how it works, of course, but if you start from the picture, for the reasons just explained, we recognize this as a situation where there is romantic disloyalty, and then we put that visual frame together with the textual labels that are completely unrelated. Those labels are superimposed onto those three figures, and we sort of reconfigure that or understand that, put it all together in the overall interpretation as an amusing view of a shift from an old interest represented by the girlfriend to a new interest represented by the passing girl in the red top, basically. Going back to the idea of prototype structure, we have prototypical examples and we have all sorts of creative variations, and I'm going to show a number of them. One is to do with the kind of textual labels where the text in this example is less than a full word. So we're descending down into the domain of morphology, productivity, procrastinate. It's always more fun to procrastinate than to be productive. That's the whole problem of basically the internet and cats on the internet and so on. Or insomnia, looking sort of frustratedly at being in bed by 9. And there are other examples like that. An application of the disloyal boyfriend meme for our times, the pandemic version, because of the distancing there. So you can even make a kind of point with this one, even without any textual labels, although it also exists with textual labels like this one here. Academics move their attention away from meetings that could have been emails, a famous frustration, not just in the academic world, but in the corporate world as well, of course, lots of meetings could just have been emails. And now the next big thing is Zoom, and a lot of Zoom meetings, of course, could also just have been emails. Not this one, of course. Another sort of obvious extension, perhaps, well, obvious if you've seen examples like this, if like me, you spend too much time on the internet, it's obvious, where instead of having textual labels, you have, again, pictures. So in this case, you know, come the festive season, the cat turns its attention away from the cat tree that it usually plays with and climbs on and so on, towards this superior thing to climb on and play with, the Christmas tree. And very amusing example, but in a way it re-literalizes the meme because it makes it all about romantic situation again. This is Henry VIII shifting attention from one wife to the next again, to the next again, to the next again, to the next again. This is a bit distasteful, but unfortunately it's also part of reality. Trump being more interested in his daughter than his wife in some of his weird interview fragments. So here, different people appear in the meme. Similarly here, a comment on Brexit. Leavers are more interested in the same old bullshit, represented here visually in the shape of Boris Johnson than in facts. Now, the interesting thing with some of these versions where other people appear, instead of the original 3 stock characters, is that sometimes you get really sort of brain twisters. The example here is you see Theresa May, the former Prime Minister, and her husband Philip May to her left, and some unidentified person to her right. She's kind of ignoring her husband Philip and looking at this younger man. But if you look at the labels, the 2 men represent 2 versions of her proposed, ultimately failed Brexit deals. And Theresa May, of course a Conservative Party member, is labeled as Eurosceptic Labour MPs. So there's an obvious clash there between the actual person being represented and the label being used, which kind of makes it more impactful and striking. Similarly, I have several examples with this image. A lot of them have to do with the gay scenario, not so much this one in a way, but it's really intriguing in the sense that the sort of beefy man passing in the background, walking through the sea there, is labeled as the wife in this pic. So I'm more interested in the wife in this picture, the one in the wedding dress, than in my actual wife, who is not in this picture, of course, right? So it's really quite clever. At the same time, we can very quickly come to an interpretation of this because we've become so used to these 3 positions and this shift of focus or shift of attention or shift of preference from one to another. So schematizing that a little bit, we sort of start on the left-hand side of the diagram here from the original stock photograph, abstracting away from that to just have basically some conceptualizer who is positionally near to. Doesn't have to be the case that the conceptualizer is in the middle, but it just has to be sort of physically, positionally nearer to the old interest, and then you have the new interest at a slightly greater distance passing by. From that more abstract schema, you then get all of these different, and there are many more than the few here, of course. I've included the 2 that we've just seen, and also sort of a meta meme there, Star Trek version of that meme, being more interested than the original popular meme in the middle example of those 3 there. I've just added 2 slides here to say a few words about types of things going viral, types of virality, where people on the internet basically their fancy has been tickled, something has really struck them, their attention has really been grabbed, and they want to be creative with it. And a lot of the times that can be image driven. There's an image that is just really impressive, or people find really funny or fascinating or hilarious or whatever, and they are going to do stuff with it. So image-based virality, you might say. An example here from a year ago, when that big ship was stuck in the Suez Canal and lots of other ships couldn't go through, etc. And then you had the tiny little excavator that was going to do something to sort of allow the ship to come loose. And lots of people created memes based on this picture and also other related pictures. When it's, you know, this picture, the idea is that, you know, what is this tiny little excavator going to do to resolve this huge problem? So in the example here, things I need to do, this is sort of huge, insurmountable, I'm never going to get on top of all of my work, versus me with my tiny little excavator. So not up to the job, basically. A more recent example from a few months ago, this was a red carpet picture taken at the whatever film festival somewhere. Is it Cannes? I don't know. Presenting the film or the premiere of House of Gucci, and you have 3 actors from House of Gucci. So you have Lady Gaga, Jared Leto, and Adam Driver. Lady Gaga is dressed very extravagantly. Jared Leto is dressed fashionably, perhaps not as extravagantly as Lady Gaga, and then Adam Driver is basically in a business suit, quite soberly. And so what you saw is lots of people just taking that picture and adding a top line. So to create a meme, you don't even have to put, or a labeling meme, you don't even have to go to the trouble of actually putting the labels on the image. You don't have to be technically proficient. You can just add a top line. So here, for instance, poster presentation, oral presentation, keynote speech, reflecting sort of stages in academic careers. Very often young researchers start with poster presentations, they move on to oral presentations, and hopefully they end up with keynote speeches and so on. And this one, of course, is this week's sort of flavor of the week, as it were. Lots of memes have been made based on this incident at the Oscars earlier this week, where Will Smith slapped Chris Rock in the face. Here, combined, not very spectacular, perhaps, with the clocks changing versus me being slapped across the face. Other kinds of virality is more driven by the event. Something happens and people want to make memes based on that. So the event here in this example is a very modest event. There was a Facebook outage, and because Facebook also owns WhatsApp and Instagram, those apps and sites also didn't work. And of course, Twitter did work, and everybody who used Twitter was feeling very good about themselves and sharing these sorts of memes. So here, you know, Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram are dead, whereas the guy in front of the picture making the V sign, Twitter is very much alive, or the kebab shop version of that. There's a Mr. Bean version of that here. Well, you can sort of see the contrast between the move at all, who's in a wheelchair, and Mr. Bean, who sort of enjoys showing that he can still move his legs about and that he has no difficulty at all. So this adds a dimension of video, of movement, of temporality, and that's another kind of extension of labeling memes. Of course, this takes quite a bit more work to do, so you wouldn't expect this to catch on and become a very productive sort of construction, because it's just a bit too much work. So I'm just going to play this one here. See the EU referendum. David Cameron opens the boot, the dog jumps out, representing 50% of the voters, and la 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 la, it darts into this huge pile of leaves representing economic disaster. So by way of a comment on the Brexit vote. Twitter has very limited visual media. Of course, you can attach a picture to a tweet, but if you just use the basic means of typing messages on Twitter, what you do have, of course, are emoji. And one form of a labeling meme on Twitter is simply reproducing, specifically the example of the handshake meme, which I haven't mentioned yet, but there are pictures of handshakes where in the handshake you show the thing that is shared by 2 otherwise unrelated things, a sort of surprising thing that 2 things share. You can reproduce that on Twitter. That's not a Twitter-specific meme. Here you do have 1 or 2 examples of Twitter-specific labeling memes, or at least I would consider them labeling memes, where you simply use a very minimal visual means afforded by using emoji. So here you have 2 pinpoints that you would place on a map, and you have the sort of ruler that you place alongside it to measure the distance between those 2 points on a map. You have a sort of a quote, a fictive quote there at the top. This is the last time I'm eating out, and then I'll eat healthy. And then you have That's the sort of positive intention. And then you have the reality, 2-minute walk takeaway. So I'm not living up to the sort of cultural norms or the ambitions that I set myself. Similarly, the one at the bottom there, even more simplistic visually, but again, you do have those points on the map, and you just use those pipe symbols and those dashes to sort of chart a pathway. And the point here is that instead of going straight to the good goal, self-care, for instance, you make a detour and you go to something, a face mask, not in the pandemic sense, but pre-pandemically, I don't know what it is actually, but putting some sort of L'Oreal something on your face, or whatever, or olive oil, I don't know anything about this, but anyway, that sort of idea. So again, it's not a picture, it's not as visually rich, of course, as labeling memes, but I think this is basically a Twitter version of a labeling meme. Something that is a bit close, but also a bit different, I think, because there is no real sort of figurative mapping from one domain to another, but there is a kind of labeling, is this sort of example where you use a word or a logo and you treat it as if it's something that has temporal extent, and you can distinguish portions in time, so that prior to university and at the start of university, you have this idea of, oh, I did good in high school, I think I'm smart, I'll do good at uni. And then the larger section of being at university is, I don't belong here, I'm the stupidest person to walk the face of this earth. So, you know, the imposter syndrome and feeling very insecure about your performance and so on. Or similarly with Twitter, when you start Twitter at first, you think, hey, this is kind of cool, I can talk to my friends and celebrities. But then the larger share, if you stay on it long enough, I have never been more mentally ill. This is messing with my brain because, you know, so much is happening, I can't keep up. So it shares something with labeling, but it doesn't share that sort of mapping from one domain to another. Continuing very, very briefly with a few examples here, the theme opened up here with the Brexit example, with the dog darting into the pile of leaves, some video uses of labeling memes. The point made in the slide is simply to say that, you know, serious people use this seriously to convince audiences. So here we have the Senator John Ossoff. You know, there had to be a runoff election. The election was too close to call in November or whenever it was to become one of the senators for the state of Georgia or whatever it is, I don't remember exactly. So there had to be a runoff election. So he had to really campaign to win it. Eventually he did win it. That was important for the Democrats to get the balance of power in the US Senate. There was a plan for a $600 stimulus in the context of the COVID pandemic, which Donald Trump had put into action. And here he's basically suggesting, you know, there are so many costs that people have. This is never going to cut it. We have to have a $2,000 stimulus. And the tweet that he sent out only contained this meme. It didn't contain any text. So just this moving meme. More recently, John Hopkins School of Public Health or something put labels on top of this short excerpt, it's 18 seconds or something, from the Home Alone film, where the burglars are trying to break into the house where Ethan has been left home alone because he's been forgotten by his family at Christmas time. And he's using these buckets of paint to knock out the two burglars. And you see basically the vaccine knocked out the Delta variant of the coronavirus. And then we now need the booster to knock out the Omicron variant of the coronavirus. And a more recent example, again, there is actually sound, but things are complicated enough to get this to work. So this is the version without sound, but you get the idea of image. This is Thierry Breton, the EU commissioner, who put out this sort of label of an excerpt from the West to advertise the Digital Services Act that the EU is proposing. So disinformation and so on, and all those sorts of things. Final kind of possible extension is in this sort of 4-part meme, which is based on a scene from Star Trek. Now, I've seen the scene because I looked it up, but I haven't seen Star Wars. Just as I've never seen The Lord of the Rings, I just looked at the excerpt to understand the context of the one does not simply walk into Mordor. But you've got these two people, Anakin and Padme or something, having a discussion. The original version of this is something like, I don't know, I want to change the world or something, and then she says, for the better, right? And then in the bottom right, for the better, right? Because she started to doubt his good intentions. It's not a literal quote from the film. It's not literally in that scene, but it sort of captures the idea of the dynamic between those characters. And this has become reapplied across different examples here. I have a meeting at 2, but I'll call you after that. You know it's 5 to 3 right now, right? You know it's 5 to 3, right? That sort of look of consternation and doubt and confusion and so on. So here it's as if lines of dialogue are being presented as sort of fake subtitles, and that seems to share something with this idea of labeling images, except of course you add the narrative structure in this sort of example. So it's almost in between the initial examples of labeling memes and the video examples. This isn't a video, but it still has the temporal dimension because you sort of read it from left to right, and then again at the bottom from left to right as a sequence, a mini narrative sequence. Okay, so I'm almost at the end now. I just added this little tweet from JP Brammer. Every day I'm subjected to images and text. And then he responded to his own tweet with those images there. It's a good summary of what happens on the internet. You are constantly bombarded with images and text. The only point I'm making here is that obviously if we're interested in social media discourse, we have to be interested in images and text, not just the text, right? It depends what you're looking at, but obviously you want to have as complete a picture as possible. So it may be necessary to include images, it may be necessary to include sound, it may be necessary to include video and so on. Here you have some pictures from my 2018 visit to X, just to embellish the slide. So I've been throwing a lot of examples at you and you've been extremely patient, but of course you haven't really had much choice because I have the microphone and you don't. But anyway, I guess some general points that I'm trying to make here is, and these are probably a little bit obvious, is the importance of studying online discourse in all its richness, as I was just saying with the JP Brammer quote there, including whichever non-textual dimensions are being exploited, which add to the attractiveness and the impactfulness of the social media discourse. I suggested that using linguistic constructions as a lens to interpret the way in which image and text combine can be fruitful, and at the same time it can sort of allow us to reassess or expand our notion of what a construction is for social media discourse. It's so pervasive, it's such a big part of life in the 21st century that, you know, it makes perfect sense to say linguistics, it's not just a lexicon, it's not just a constructicon, it's also the memecon. We also have to have a sort of structured inventory of what exists in terms of meme constructions. Among the meaning-making mechanisms that I highlighted are frames and simile, viewpoints and quotation and humor. And well, I hope we've seen some examples of meme genres and subgenres, and sometimes some very quick and easy forms emerge, like the example there with the picture of the 3 actors on the red carpet. You don't have to actually go into any meme generator site, let alone go into not PowerPoint, I forget, Photoshop or Microsoft Paint or whatever, to add the labels on top of it. You can just write a line of text and add the picture, or on Facebook, you can write a Facebook status like a when clause and add a picture to create a when meme without actually having to create a single digital object. So, you know, even your mother or your grandmother or your father or your grandfather or whatever can play with memes. Just a word of thanks here. Grégoire already referred to my colleague Barbara Dancygier, so a lot of joint work with her on memes has also informed what I've been presenting, especially the earlier parts of what I've been presenting. And indeed, we're working on more I'm not sure it's going to be published soon because with the pandemic, everything's been delayed, but we are certainly still working on a book. Okie doke, thank you very much for listening to me for such a long time. I hope it has made some sense.
Thank you very much, Lieven, for this vivid and fascinating presentation. Thank you so much. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions, either on Zoom or in Aix-en-Provence. Who would like to start? Allez-y.
So I don't know if the people on Zoom heard the question. So it was a question about sort of the generation gap, essentially. Why do the question asked as parents, let's just say that, not necessarily put the text and image together or not necessarily understand what's going on? I guess in a way, one of my reactions would be bless them, you know. I mean, maybe it gives them a more peaceful life not to have to take what is in. If I were to show any of this to my mother, she wouldn't understand. So I think it takes a particular sort of, even though she, you know, she uses email, she uses the internet, she uses WhatsApp and so on. So maybe I could imagine, we should actually test that. I could imagine her understanding a when meme, because I think that's not so difficult to sort out. But I'm sure there are some that are really quite difficult to sort out. If you've never seen a labeled meme, are you immediately going to sort of know what the point is? So I'm not sure I have a real answer, because as you know, the answer is contained in your question, I suppose, in a sense, a generation gap. I don't know if it's just an age thing. I'm sure there are young people who, you know, read books instead of tweet, and again, bless them. But it is something that does change in the sense that I do think, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook or on, you know, in other contexts, I do think images, in all sorts of ways, have become so much more important. Of course, you know, images were very important in the Middle Ages. People could read, and that's how they sort of learned about the Bible, etc. In different ways, images have always been important. But I do have the feeling that images have become so important in everyday communication that even as linguists, you have to have a visual interest as well. So I've said all sorts of things that maybe have not very directly answered your question. Je comprends le français aussi, enfin je le parle, mais pas très bien. N'hésitez pas de parler le français, mais
vous d'abord.
On est très complémentaires comme ça.
Une question en ligne. La recherche, c'est que les plateformes, les supports, en fait, ces médias, on va émerger le plus de même. Et est-ce qu'il y a une plateforme en particulier, qui a des thèmes un petit peu plus images, c'est pas en Twitter, c'est Twitter, domaine sarcastique.
So I'm not sure if people on Zoom probably didn't hear that. So there was a question about sort of platforms, different platforms where you can find memes, you find more or more interesting or more trashy or more sarcastic ones on certain platforms compared to others. And there was a second part to the question. Yeah, so would one particular platform be a sort of a more fertile ground to find relevant examples of memes? I'm sure there is an interesting answer to that. I'm not sure I have it. My impression is that perhaps a lot of things come from Reddit ultimately, and I'm not a heavy user of Reddit. I know it exists, and I might occasionally find the results on Google. And then the next step might be Twitter, and once it reaches Facebook, it's very old.
right? So that seems to come at the end of the food chain, as it were. That seems to be the least innovative platform, but that's really just an impression. The question about sort of, the more trashy, sarcastic, humorous ones is really interesting because, I think the ones that most people are mostly exposed to do tend to have a lightness of touch and a lightness of subject matter. I remember the example of the fail meme, where you just have the word fail or the word epic fail on top of an image. Like, for instance, you have a cat had an operation, so you have this sort of thing around the face of the cat so that it can't keep scratching its wound open, and then it's trying to eat and it can't sort of eat the food, and then you have the word fail. And in one of the articles, I think it was by somebody called Eric Jenkins, he sort of made the observation, this only works with lighthearted.
You couldn't have a picture of people who died in the Holocaust and then put fail or epic fail. That would just be cruel, right? So there is that natural link with humor and lightness of touch. At the same time, you do have horrible sort of dark web networks. You have 4chan and 8chan. I know these things exist, but again, it's not something that I frequent, or that was the French sense of frequent that I've ever been on. Memes are certainly obviously also used by extreme right-wing groups, for instance, to make very distasteful jokes. We might dislike that, and of course I do dislike that, but I wonder if even there it's still not basically a humorous mechanism, even if it is applied in a sort of a cruel, exploitative way, targeting victims, right? But that's an intriguing question.
Professor Sophie Marnette has a question for you.
Yes, first of all, I really enjoyed your talk. Yeah, I wanted to ask, to what extent is what you're doing, the memes that you are speaking about, to what extent are they language dependent? Would there be any example that you might have found where actually, I mean, obviously you might have been looking at Flemish, but like in French, that something that was done in French would not be transferable to English, or the contrary? I personally cannot see any example of that, but I was just wondering whether that could be the case.
Many thanks. Oh, sorry, I missed the first sentence, but I think I got most of the question because I had to sort of mute my speakers on the computer here. That's a really interesting question. It's not something I've worked on myself, but I have seen examples of, for instance, there's a paper by Zenner Geeraerts about image macro memes, and it's specifically about wordplay. So jeu de mots, puns in memes. And of course, most of their examples are English, but they do have a number of categories where you have multilingual memes. And so in order to get the joke of the meme, you need to know a word in Spanish, or a word in Italian, or a word in French. I mean, one example that suddenly sort of hits me is, it's extremely silly, but anyway, you have a picture of Angelina Jolie, and then there's a sort of Photoshop picture turning her into a kind of witch, and it says Angelina led. Okay, it's not very funny, right? Or there's an example of women sort of dancing with these sort of straw skirts in Hawaii or something like that, in very bright colors, and then the text is something like muchas gracias, but it's written as much as, so ass, showing ass as it were, and grassy ass, because the skirts are made of a kind of grass. And again, these memes don't work very well if you sort of explain them verbally. But obviously, in those sorts of examples, you do need to have some knowledge of other languages. So I think that's a really interesting domain, probably not just for the example of puns. I mean, obviously for puns, it's going to be particularly relevant to look at examples of mixing of languages, or relying on another language, even if you don't mix them. You might still sort of rely on multilingualism that way. Outside of the case of puns, obviously, I'm not very experienced with that because I work on English, in English, and even if I'm sort of, taking part in social media networks myself, it's essentially in English. Even though my native language is Dutch, I can't immediately think of examples that would be particularly Dutch. I'm sure those do exist, but I wonder if they wouldn't tend to be very derivative in the sense of sort of being derived from English examples, because, you know, people who speak Dutch speak English as well. They would see the English examples, and as a kind of a joke, they make a Dutch or even a mixed sort of partly Dutch, partly English version of that. So as you will have noticed, all of these examples or questions lead me to sort of brainstorm and freewheel. They're not really answers to questions, but that's a reflection of the fact that they're interesting questions. So,
oh, but thank you. And
that wasn't a real answer.
thank you. And my first sentence was
I have a
simply to
question
say
in the
that I
chat,
really enjoyed
chat
your
from
talk.
Elisio.
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Okay. So I wanted to ask you if you were planning on working about memes such as Chad, Karen, etc.
I'm very sorry. I was
slow reactivating my sound, so I didn't hear the question. Sorry, could you go?
Oh, okay. Maybe I can type it.
Well, now I hear you. So now
Oh, okay. So I wanted to know if you were planning to work on memes such as Karen or Chad, for example.
Such as
Karen and Chad, for example.
Possibly, if I knew what they were, I might. The problem is meme knowledge. For instance, the example I gave you, you know, that last one with the dialogue with the 4 images, I only learned this week that they're referred to as, and I've already forgotten the first name, Anakin, was it, and Padme? I knew the meme, I keep seeing it, but I didn't know the name. Part of meme proficiency is often knowing the name, right? And I'm afraid I don't know the one that you're referring to.
Maybe I can send them to you because I'm working on them. So I was wondering if someone was already doing it, so maybe
there's
not.
no direct competition, because clearly I
Okay.
Go ahead, because I've never heard of it.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, cheers. Are there some questions? Wait. We. So for the people on Zoom, there was a question about TikTok, and this relates, of course, to the earlier question about which platforms and so on. I'm not a TikTok addict. I have seen examples on TikTok, so I can't say very much about it. There's one type of example that is slightly like the labeling memes, and for that reason, I did look at some examples of that. The example I'm thinking of is there's a kind of song, I forget what it's called, but it sort of lists all of the names of the countries in the world. And so there's somebody, as you do on TikTok, you dance to music. That's sort of one of the main points of TikTok. And there's somebody sort of moving to that. And the video image is simply split into 2 halves. And that's a way of categorizing. So they jump from left to right, depending on whether, for instance, country that has legalized same-sex marriage, country that hasn't legalized same-sex marriage, and then they jump to the corresponding category, making the point that there aren't many countries who have legalized same-sex marriage or something like that, or countries that have been invaded by Britain. I mean, that's a shorthand way of saying we're part of the British Empire, I suppose, that sort of thing, and jumping from left to right and making it clear, of course, implicitly, sometimes also in the color of the labels that I use, like green versus red, which viewpoint the person performing in the TikTok video associates with. That's the one example that comes to mind. I've seen some other things on TikTok that are interesting in terms of perspective, and I'm trying to remember. There's this guy who's sort of sing songs from another perspective that I've sort of forgotten. I'd have to go back and look, so I can't really make sense of that right now. I'm sure, again, I haven't answered your question. I've just said the one thing that I can sort of relate to. You know, the topic is so vast and the platforms are so vast and sometimes quite different. I think if you compare Reddit to Twitter and Facebook, of course, they work very differently. They have very different sort of sociological profiles of people who use those platforms. But in terms of the kind of social media discourse, there is a lot that you can compare and a lot of similarity. I think TikTok has such a specific original aim. I'm sure it's developed since, but originally it was really designed, I suppose, mostly to show off dancers without any textual labels, without any particular messages. Of course, as soon as there is a new thing, people are going to start exploiting it creatively and interestingly and make it something more interesting, so that now politicians feel that they have to communicate via TikTok and so on. But I have to admit, I haven't explored it myself very much. I'm not a very good dancer, so maybe that's part of the reason.
Oui, vous voulez poursuivre?
So the question is, how do you begin to work on such a vast field? Or?
Yeah, because it seems
just for the people on Zoom, right? Because it's, the whole subject domain evolves the whole time, changes the whole time. Well, I guess this is relatively new for me too. It's sort of almost by accident that my colleague and myself sort of got into this topic. The very first one that we ever looked at was a said no one ever meme, and that has obvious sort of links to my area of specialization, which is on reported speech, quotation, and so on. I think there's no shame in being a bit behind the curve. I think if you are interested in social media discourse, it's kind of natural that there is a kind of delay between the things that are, you know, happening right now. You can't immediately sort of incorporate that or process that and analyze that, except of course it depends, like the previous talk we had in the seminar. Of course, if you're interested in what sorts of things are being discussed on Twitter, or even purely linguistic things, linguistic construction on Twitter, etc., you can sort of instantly use Twitter as a corpus and so on, right? But then again, you're just looking, well, not just, but I mean, then you're probably mainly looking at the textual aspects of Twitter. But if you're interested in internet memes, as you were saying, you know, new ones are being added on a daily basis, or perhaps even, you know, quicker. You can't keep track of all of that. And also, even though I think my colleague and myself, we've looked at a variety of memes, but of course we haven't looked at everything, and I keep being pointed to all sorts of corners that we haven't covered, like the multilingualism angle or the TikTok angle and so on. So of course there's always more. But whatever you do as a researcher, you know, those sorts of considerations, I mean, we all suffer from imposter syndrome, I certainly do, but at the same time, you shouldn't feel overwhelmed by the fact that there is so much. You should just focus on your niche and focus on something that really appeals to you and go for that. And typically what happens is you start with your little corner and it grows into something bigger and bigger because you start seeing links with other things and other things and other things and other things. And perhaps, you know, eventually you will have a more global understanding of phenomena, probably still without really having looked at everything, because there is far too much to look at, right? But I think that probably goes for any domain of science. You know, I'm sure if you ask a biologist looking at amoeba or whatever, you know, that's probably very overwhelming for them as well. So perhaps we shouldn't think that we're special in that respect.
Are there any questions?
Either in the chat or here in Aix-en-Provence. I have a question myself. One of my major interests today is the way how corpora are built. And I would like to know how you managed to choose and select posts, and especially memes. When you work on social media, the idea is how to have a given corpus, how to constitute this corpus, And this is a point I will discuss on the 1st of June in a virtual session of Zoom for Maison Française d'Oxford.
Yeah, that's a very
question, of course, again, like all questions. I have to admit, so far, basically the way that I've worked and that I've worked with my colleague is just collect as many examples as you can. And as you keep collecting them, you start structuring them somewhat, but it's a bit unsatisfactory. It's not a corpus like you would go into the whatever the Bank of English or the British National Corpus or whatever textual corpus you use. We have established methods of extracting data, of processing data, and so on. Here, of course, we're perhaps not in uncharted territory, but in different territory. And forming some sort of database where you could upload your memes or whatever and share them and show how you structured them and so on, that would be a useful step. Unfortunately, I don't have the talent to do that. So for the moment, basically what we do is just, have huge folders with lots of stuff, and gradually we try to sort them into folders which make sense, where there's a sort of a cohesion between the things that are included in those folders, and we share them between my colleague and myself, for instance, and so on. But yeah, that's almost manual work, right? So that's of course not the sort of big data type of work. Maybe that can be done, but it can't be done by me because I don't have the skills.
Thank you. Laura?
I would like to say that in a purely linguistic sense, memes are like super interesting because it relies on common ground as well, which can be addressing and different stuff. And in a discourse, when you're writing, for example, using an exclamation mark, it can be interpreted as excitement with irritation with the same sentence in the same situation. But it means like it's not possible. You do understand what people want to say. And just a question, like, do you think it's a passing trend or a long-lasting session?
Right. So thank you for that first point, because actually I did realize that I put a lot of stuff in the slides, and there's lots of stuff that, of course, I also didn't put in. And in our publication together in 2017, we did sort of stress this notion of sort of intersubjectivity, the idea that you're more or less on the same page as your viewer. You sort of assume that the person who's going to view and read your meme probably shares your idea that crocs are awful, or that it's rude to always expect people to listen to you and never listen to them, and all these sorts of things. So there's a lot of, as you say, common ground that's being shared there. It often assumes that your reader or viewer of the meme at least recognizes your viewpoint and probably shares it, that sort of idea. Okay, by saying that, I've forgotten your question, sorry. Oh yeah, passing fad. Gosh.
Article which said like if you're still using memes, you're has-been. But it's not true when the Will Smith like it's everywhere, every time.
Yeah. So for the people on Zoom, the question here was, do you think that memes are a passing fad? Because some people, of course, those are the typical social commentators who have to write columns and who have to write these sorts of things. So people saying that, if you still use memes, you're so passé or you're behind the times. They're so attractive. They've been going for quite a while. Of course, some of them become old, like the said no one ever meme is really old, and the one does not simply meme is really old. But even though it's old, it's still being used. So one of the interesting questions for me is which ones are going to last, and what do we mean by ones that last? How long is long? Right? I have no idea. But to think that they're a passing fad, I don't think so. I mean, memes in general, in the original Dawkins sense, of course, are certainly not passing fads. Items of cultural replication song have always existed, will always exist. Now that a lot of our lives is online, these culturally shared memes will also continue to exist, perhaps in different forms as we develop new devices, new platforms and so on. but I don't think it's just a fad. I think it's here to stay. Perhaps it would be good for our peace of mind and our mental health if they did, disappear, but I don't think they will. But that's just, that's just my intuition, of course. I mean, I have no reason for saying that. Thanks.
Merci beaucoup. Est-ce que vous pensez qu'un GIF, c'est
So there's a question here about GIFs or GIFs. So recently, the inventor of the GIF very recently died, I think I read. So 2 seconds silence for that. Are they memes? Well, I haven't really thought about that. They're certainly very close in use. I mean, I'm thinking especially of the reaction GIFs, right? So when somebody tweets something or writes something on Facebook and you respond to it, not by writing something, but you respond to it by a sort of a GIF, a moving little thing. I guess you could probably make a sort of distinction again, a sort of a spectrum between the ones that are very recognizable, very, highly entrenched, used, not by everyone, of course, but by everyone of a certain sort of online speech community, and ones that are perhaps much more idiosyncratic. But I think probably that you can certainly think of the practice of using reaction GIFs as a kind of internet meme. And then when it comes to specific ones, there I suppose you would make a distinction between more generally shared ones and more idiosyncratic ones. It's certainly in the same area of interest and investigation, I suppose. But again, it's not something I've really looked at myself.
Some comments in the chat by Ahmed and Sandra. Maybe you would like to react, Lieven.
Yes, so emojis, very interesting. I touched on them a little bit as components of these sort of Twitter versions of labeling memes, but they're used in many other ways. One of the interesting things I think I've seen on Twitter, for instance, is using them. I remember an example where it's like, schools be like is the first line, and then it's stuff like, I don't know, sexual aggression, and then you have the sort of shrug emoji, and homophobia, and you have the sort of shrug emoji, and then you have something like wearing the wrong uniform, and you have a very angry emoji, and I don't know, speaking when you're not allowed to speak, and you have a very angry emoji. So again, I'm trying to explain something that is much easier to understand if you see it in front of you, of course, but the idea of that sort of tweet is using very minimal means, just a few words, schools be like, and then you have a sort of a contrast between two sets of attitudes. They sort of shrug off things that actually they should attach greater importance to, forms of discrimination, and they attach a lot of importance to and get very angry about, silly little rules of everyday sort of behavior in a school. So that's one of the interesting ways in which emoji have been used and sort of related to, it's a sort of a direct, almost mimetic use of them, right? Because of course, fundamentally, that's what the face emoji are supposed to do. They're supposed to reflect emotional responses, like a very simplified form of reaction GIFs, you might say. Famously, when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, there was, there's a rule that you're not allowed to take pictures in the House of Commons. And as a joke, one of the members of the front bench on the government side, James Cleverly, name is not really an omen in his case, but anyway, wrote a tweet saying, well, I'm not allowed to take a picture, but here's an impression of the opposite bench. And he used all of these emoji of sad looking and angry looking emoji to represent the opposition, the Labour front bench, and then Angela Rayner, who's the deputy leader of the Labour Party, responded by saying, here's my impression of the other side, and then they were all clowns. Anyway, sorry, I'm rambling again, just to suggest that I have thought about emoji. They're very interesting. Some books have been published on them by Viv Evans and by Philip Sargent, so those people know a lot more about emoji than I do.
We have an interesting question by Daria in the chat.
I don't know what demotivators are. So that's...
I don't know either.
Oh gosh. Could you explain?
Daria, if you can speak or just ask your question in the chat.
Yes, sorry. Demotivators seem to have appeared in the late 90s or the year 2000, and in fact you had the black font and a large picture in the middle of the slide, and then a text beneath the picture that somehow interacted with the picture, and the idea was to contradict the message that was given by the picture. For example, well, if I've just went to on the Wikipedia page devoted to demotivators, and there is the huge picture of a stadium full of people and a small message underneath saying you spent 2 weeks writing an article on something, and then it gets corrected by the users, by the following users that get access to the page. I guess, well, it was quite popular at some point, and now they are out of fashion. And I thought that they are an evolution, that memes are a certain evolution of demotivators.
Yeah, thank you very much. I had never heard of that term, but I think you're right, and it reminds me again. That's all I can do, sort of react by sort of remembering other things that are perhaps a little bit similar. With the when memes, we now, or at least I now, think of them as having a when clause and then any picture, basically. But originally, they were textual, that moment when, and it just sort of recounted sort of a recognizable sort of thing, the sort of thing. That moment when you smile very broadly, you think you're recognizing somebody in the street, and then at the last moment you realize, oh, actually, I don't know that person, it's somebody else, so I'll just pretend that I was smiling at somebody else, sorts of things. And then the first version of those that added in a little visual just added sort of a hand-drawn little face. So it was very, very basic. So I do suppose, even though we don't quite know where they're going back in time a little bit might be a more feasible task to see what early forms of memes may have been. Even the image macro memes, like, I've used examples like the Good Girl Jean and the Scumbag Steve, but early on you tended to have this sort of very colorful background with a face in the middle, or a dog, or a person's face in the middle. So they were much more basic. So I do think there is a history to be written of, early forms of memes. In his article on when memes, Adrian Liu in 2017 does do that a little bit for when memes. But this particular notion of demotivators is very interesting. Thank you very much for that. So I will look that up further. There is so much knowledge, of course. I see the link there, and I'm grateful for the link as well. There is so much knowledge stored on websites like Know Your Meme. There's just far too much there, so somebody should edit a selection of that so that everybody who wants to can gain basic knowledge of the starting points of memes or something. Thank you very much.
Y a-t-il encore une dernière question? Loïs?
The usual life after the constructive memes. But I was just thinking about when I feel Frog was hijacked by the alt-right. Is this a trend that we see a lot in memes, that memes are used differently by different political leanings, or is this more of an anomalous result?
So for the people on Zoom, the question was about sort of the way in which Pepe the Frog was hijacked by sort of extreme right-wing sorts of people and organizations, and that's something that we see more often. So I'm not part of those circles, thankfully, but I did once read a very interesting article. I should try to find it again, about 4chan and 8chan. So I know there's a world out there, and even in Flanders, the part of Belgium that I'm from, there's a sort of a bit like the Génération Identitaire or something. Doesn't that exist in France? There's similar sorts of movements where memes have been part of the story as related in the press. So actually memes sometimes have a really bad press, a bad image, because people associate them, sometimes associate them with these sorts of uses of, you know, making fun of the Holocaust in memes or those sorts of things. I think the Pippi the Frog thing is a bit of a unique phenomenon. I'm not sure that we see that replicated among many different cases. I also wonder how creative some of those sort of, you know, extreme right-wing memes are, but it might take a person with different interests or leanings to really investigate those. But I do recognize that, you know, by, you know, the way in which we choose our platforms, where we look for data, we exclude some other kinds of data. So to get a fuller picture, it would be interesting to also complement that perhaps rosy and sunny picture with the sort of darker sides of the dark web, as it were, and so on. Thanks.
Merci beaucoup pour toutes vos questions. Je pense que nous allons conclure la conférence de Lieven Vandelanotte. Une nouvelle fois, nous allons le remercier pour sa conférence très très riche et évidemment qui pose aussi des questions sur lesquelles nous aurons l'occasion de revenir dans les prochaines séances du séminaire. Je vous tiendrai informé des différentes séances qui seront programmées dans les prochains mois. À partir de septembre, il y aura tout un cycle de conférences qui seront organisées et je ne manquerai pas, voilà, de vous tenir informé. Merci à tous et bonne soirée, à bientôt et merci encore à Lieven Vandelanotte. Merci beaucoup.
Merci.